Welcome back to When Harry Met Board Games, where we feed our people with relatable content, and our victory condition is your satisfaction. I'm Harry, and today we have another top 10 list for you all. Actually, we have another top 5 list for you all. Well, more exactly, we have another top 8 list for you all, because today I'm going to be covering my top 8 board games by designer Wolfgang Kramer. And Wolfgang Kramer is a very prolific designer within the industry, and he is probably, of all the board game designers that's still currently active, that's still currently creating and producing board games, of all the designers in the industry, he is probably the one who's been doing it for the longest. Wolfgang Kramer has been designing board games since the early 1970s, probably even from the late 1960s. So he's been doing this for a while, and he's still going on strong. Now, Wolfgang Kramer is known for doing lots of co-designs, in particular with his favorite partner, Michael Kiesling, and lots of those collaborations will find their way onto my list. However, he does work with other co-designers, and he does make board games on his own as well. So I'm covering 8 board games of his on this list because I've only played 9 Wolfgang Kramer designs. The 9th one will not warrant making it onto this list because I didn't really like it so much, and I also don't even own the game. I played it a handful of times. That's Heimlich and Co. It's one of his earlier designs from the early 1980s. That game did not make it onto this list. But with no further ado, we're going to go straight to the actual list with my number 8. And my number 8 Wolfgang Kramer game of all time is Downforce. And this right here is the reimagining of Downforce from Restoration Games. And Restoration Games is basically known, it's a publishing company, basically known for taking old classic designs and kind of like reinvigorating them, reinventing them to meet the standards of the modern board game hobby. So while this might be many people's favorite Kramer design, it's only number 8 for me because, first of all, I do enjoy this game. It's a race-themed game where players are kind of controlling a car, but at the same time they're also making bets, and you can bet on another person's car. So at the end of the game, your victory points, if you will, the money in this game, is a combination of where your car, or cars, if you have multiple cars depending on the player count, where your cars finish in the race, combined with if you successfully betted on the correct car. And again, if you win the race and bet it on yourself, then you're pretty much guaranteed to win the game. So it's a really cool, neat idea, and it's not dice rolling that manipulates the card. It's actually really cool and creative card play. One of the reasons why I'm not going to give it too much credit, or at least give Kramer too much credit for it, is because this reimagining of it with the developers from Restoration Games does introduce some things. It removes some aspects of gameplay, makes it a cleaner, more streamlined experience, and at the same time it adds variable player power. So all the players have different player powers and feel different from all the other people around the table. So again, I did not play the original design, which I believe was made in the early 1970s. So I cannot give it too much credit. I have not tried that design, but for this implementation of Downforce, it's going to make to my number 8 on Wolfgang Kramer's board games of all time. Now let's move on to my number 7. My number 7 is Cusco. And Cusco here is a reprint, or a second edition of sorts, with a new theme of Java. And Java was the second game in the Mask trilogy of games by Kramer and Kiesling. So this is a co-design with Michael Kiesling, who I alluded to earlier. And Cusco, the rebranding of Cusco, which is in Ecuador or Peru, I believe, Machu Picchu. And this here is basically more in line with the other 2 games in the trilogy, the Mask trilogy of games, Tikal and Mezica, because it falls in line with the Central American, Native American, indigenous theme of those 2 games, which Java didn't really fall in line with it. Also, it keeps and continues and builds upon the action point allowance system, which was first invented in Tikal, where basically players get a bunch of actions they could choose from on each turn, and they have each of those actions have a different amount of action points they cost, and your players have a pool of action points that they can use on each turn. In this game in particular, it's 6 points. And again, not all the actions you could choose from cost the same amount of points. Some of these actions might cost you 2 points, others cost you only 1. So you got to budget it and make your decisions accordingly. However, this game does introduce some new elements from Tikal and builds upon that. First of all, we have the idea that you can gain actions that you can use in future turns. So actually, as a matter of fact, you start the game with 3 of these bonus action tokens. So you're going to have 3 opportunities, 3 turns during the game where you can have a massive turn and have 7 action points to spend. This game is also really cool because at the end of certain actions that are triggered, you trigger a festival during some of these temples that you're trying to build, and that festival is resolved through auction. You're playing different cards that have particular symbols, and whoever has the most symbols at the end of that bid, at the end of that auction, is going to get a certain amount of victory points from that temple. So I think that's really, really cool that it introduces auction bidding. It's a mechanism of mine that I really prefer and enjoy. And also this game adds a 3-dimensional element to the gameplay. Tikal and Mezica have lots of area control, area majority going on in a very 2-dimensional, horizontal way. Here, we build not only horizontally by placing tiles and building temples, but we also elevate the terrain by putting tiles on top of previously placed tiles, and all of a sudden we're building onto additional levels. So to have the area majority in this game, in the different areas, in the different temples and cities, not only do you have to have more people than everybody else in that region, but your people have to be at the highest elevation of that particular city, or else you do not have the majority. So I think that's a really cool and innovative wrinkle. The reason why this game is a little bit lower on my list, while I do enjoy it, I think it's a beautiful production, and I know for a fact that some of my subscribers adore this game. The reason why it's so low on this list is because I do not think that it's as good at a 2-player count as the other games in the Mass trilogy, which perhaps will make it higher on this list. My number 7 Wolfgang Kramer game of all time, Cusco. And now we move on to my number 6. And speaking of the Mass trilogy of games, it's Mezica. And I think Mezica is just a little bit simpler and quicker to play at 2 players than Cusco. If I was one of those people who primarily played 3 or 4 players, but I do lots of my gaming 2 players with my wife, in particular these games. Because of that, I had to give the edge to Mezica. I think the game, again, this is made by Super Meeple, just like Cusco's 2nd edition. This is the 2nd edition of Mezica, and the production is beautiful. The board looks gorgeous. The color, the 3-dimensional pieces here are really, really cool. You do not build the board 3-dimensionally. As a matter of fact, the only tile placement that really takes place are these canals that you are building, and these canals are very useful because you could build bridges on them, and they serve as a means of travel so that players can move throughout the board with more ease. But they also serve as a way of carving out these different regions, because the board does not start out with specified regions. You're basically carving out these regions through the placement of these canals, and the size of the regions determine how many victory points you score. And this game is actually divided into 2 halves, and it's really well done because you can end the first half being down and underneath, but you could ultimately make a comeback if you play well in the second half. This game also includes the action point allowance system, where you have a certain pool of action points and a couple of actions to choose from. Not all the actions are worth the same value of action points. And it's really cool because this is the one, not Cusco, this is the one that goes all out by allowing you to use actions to gain additional actions for future turns. And that way you can have some really massive turns in the future. That way you don't have to be frustrated and poorly use your action points because you feel like you're going to waste them anyway, you're going to lose them anyway, so might as well do something that you're not too interested in. No, instead you can gain an action point for a future turn, spend it, and again have a massive, huge, epic turn sometime down the line in the game. My number 6 Wolfgang Kramer game of all time, Mezica. And now we move on to the top 5, the cream of the crop. And my number 5 is not as heavy as some of these games that I just finished mentioning. It's Adventureland. And this is another co-design with Michael Kiesling. Again, lots of Kramer's games, especially in recent years, are co-designs with Michael Kiesling, but I'm not going to take any credit away for him for that. Adventureland, super duper light, family style game, fantasy theme. It is such a simplistic, streamlined game from a mechanism perspective. Basically, players have these adventurers who are lined up. The board consists of a grid, and each space on that grid has a coordinate, a letter and a number to designate the coordinate. And players start on the outer edges of the board, and on a player's turn, they can either move one of their adventurers as far down a column or a row in the grid as they see fit, or they can move 2 of their adventurers just one space along the grid. So maybe just make a little bit of progress with 2 characters, or perhaps make a lot of progress with 1 character. The catch in this game is that players can only move downward and rightward. You can never move upward and leftward. So once you make it to a certain part of the board, you're really limited. As a matter of fact, once you make it to the far bottom right corner of the board, you're done. That adventurer is never going to do anything else for the rest of the game. And basically in this game, you're going to spots to gather different resources. You're gathering swords, which are going to help you in battle. You're gathering herbs, which are also going to help you in battle. You're gathering coins, which are going to give you victory points throughout the game, depending on the scenario. This is a scenario-based game, and the base game comes with 3 different scenarios. You also, ultimately, most of your victory points, the heart of the game, is fighting these face-down monsters. And you do not know how powerful these monsters are. They range anywhere from about 7 to 16 in power. You do not know how powerful they are until you arrive on their space and flip it over. So it is a little bit of a press your luck, a little bit of a gamble, because you might not have enough swords and herbs and strength in order to defeat these monsters. But if you do, there is a little bit of dice rolling based on the amount of swords you play. If you do defeat them, then you're going to get a good amount of victory points. Really cool, really neat, very simplistic, but I just have a really good time playing this game. And I feel like it's the kind of game that you can easily teach to anybody. And after just about 1 minute of rules explanation, everybody around the table will get it. My number 5, Wolfgang Kramer game of all time, Adventureland. Now we move on to my number 4, and this is the originator of the mass trilogy of games, Tikal by Kramer and Kiesling. And unlike Mezica and Cusco, where I have the new revised editions, here I have the classic Rio Grande edition from the late 90s, early 2000s. Super Meeple did also come out with a new edition of Tikal, but I purchased this edition before that edition ever came out. And again, with Super Meeple's edition of games, they're all 3-dimensional, really nice, good-looking, gorgeous pieces. Not so much with Tikal, but it's not a bad-looking game for the late 90s, early 2000s either. The tiles look nice. The temples are not represented by 2-dimensional or 3-dimensional figures. Instead, they're represented by squared 2-dimensional tiles, but it serves the purpose. It's really, really cool, really neat. I love the exploration feel that I get when I play this game, because on your turn, you're always revealing a tile, and you've got to place it somewhere, and that tile represents you carving your way through the Mayan jungles in order to excavate and find what's there, discover treasure, uncover temples, and dig them further to raise their levels and therefore raise their victory point value at the end of scoring rounds. And it's so cool because this is the game that innovated the action point allowance system. And in this game, you've got 10 action points, and you've got about 6 different actions, and they range as far as anywhere as low as 1 action point to 5 action points. So it gives you a lot of crunchy decisions to make. I find that this is the most strategic and thought-provoking of the 3 games in the trilogy. And again, it just makes me feel that exploration feel that the other 2 games do not. So because of that, it goes a long way with me. I love the area majority of the game. It's pretty simple. You really got to look out for what your opponents are doing. Just a fun experience every time I play this game, and a great area majority game for 2 players. I find that it plays very well at 2 players. Usually area majority games are not very fun at 2 players. Tikal is an exception. My number 4, Wolfgang Kramer game of all time, Tikal. And now we move on to the top 3. Things are getting even better. And this is Colosseum. And this is co-designed not with Michael Kiesling. This is a co-design with Marcus Lupke. And this game here is also a second edition. It seems like lots of Kramer's games go out of print, but because of their classic nature, eventually somebody brings them back and revamps them. This here is published by Tasty Minstrel Games, and the components are very beautiful. The artwork is a little bit more cartoonish than the original publication from Days of Wonder Games. However, it's still gorgeous. The coins are authentic metal coins. Well, not authentic. I guess you cannot buy anything with them, but they're actually metal coins. Very heavy. It adds lots of weight to the box. And there's just a lot of beautiful tokens and wooden pieces in this game. Very good production. Now, this game is a game about putting a production, putting a performance, an event in the Colosseum. It's not all battle-based. It's not all about gladiators and lions as typically is depicted in lore as far as the ancient Roman Colosseum is concerned. Lots of these are performances, plays, dramas, comedies, and it's really, really cool because thematically speaking, you're not getting too much into the intricacies of Roman theater. However, what you're really doing is you're participating in auctions in order to draft these tiles, and and carry out your events. You have these different scripts or events that you're drafting throughout the game, or actually purchasing. So you got to make the money to purchase the more valuable, expensive scripts. And these are based on real literature or real pieces of drama and story from ancient times. And it's really cool because each of them have a certain quota of tokens of all these different types of icons here that need to be met in order to get to a certain threshold of spectators, people who actually come to watch your performance. And what's really cool is if you meet the quota, you're gonna get the full optimal level of spectators. However, there is a consolation prize because if you're short just one token, you're only going to lose a few spectators. If you're short maybe 2 or 3 tokens, you'll lose a little bit more, and you could probably even be missing as much as 5 or 6 tokens and still get some spectators. But eventually, you want to have a good amount of those tokens, or else you're not going to get paid at all for people to come watch your performance. And you're doing all this again through auction bidding, but also through a nice and neat trading phase. I think this is a really cool game. If you like games like Catan and are looking for a game that involves an element of trading, but at the same time a little bit more weightier as far as some of the other things and decisions that are going on, I think Colosseum is a good choice. Now, the coolest thing about this game is the fact that your final score is really just the highest score from each of your individual 5 rounds of the game. There's 5 rounds in this game, and we're all going to be putting performances at the end of each of these 5 rounds, and that's going to give us our score. And the only way our score goes up is if your subsequent performances are higher than the previous ones. So whichever is your best performance, that's going to be your final score of the game. Quite often, that is maybe your 4th performance and not your 5th. Sometimes you might be unlucky enough and it's only your 3rd for it. So I find that to be really, really cool. You can think that you're winning the whole game along, but if one player has an amazing 5th round, they can easily come back and win the game. My number 3 Wolfgang Kramer game of all time, Colosseum. And now we move on to my number 2. And my number 2 is a game that I learned recently. Haven't played this game too much, but it has blown me away. And that is Coal Baron. And this is another co-design with Michael Kiesling. And of all the games in my list, including the one I haven't mentioned yet, my number 1, this game has got to be perhaps the most boring theme of them all, and yet it's number 2. In this game, players are owners of coal mines who are trying to fulfill contracts for their different types of coal. That sounds so boring. That does not sound like a universe I want to get immersed in. I'd much rather go on a fantasy adventure like an Adventureland, or put on a performance in a Colosseum, or go into the Mayan jungles and explore for treasure and temples, or go in a race car and try to win a trophy, than be an owner of a coal mine. However, I wouldn't mind the money. But this game is so cool because in essence, it's a worker placement game. And there's all these different spots. There's basically 5 different sections of the game, and all those sections have multiple spots, but kind of do the same thing. But what's cool about this game is that players have a certain amount of workers available to them, depending on the player count. I believe if you're only playing 2 players, you have 18 workers. If you have 3, you have a little bit fewer. If you have 4, you have even fewer than that. And what happens is when you go to an empty space, you place 1 worker and you trigger that spot's action. However, if you are going to an occupied space, then you have to put 1 more worker than what's already in that spot. So as the round progresses, you've got to put 2 workers in one spot, or maybe 3 in another spot, or maybe 5 in another spot. And it forces you to make some really tough decisions. Do I want this action so badly that I'm willing to spend 5 of my workers for this round on that action? Or would I rather get this action that might not look as interesting on the surface, but it only costs me 1 worker to do so? I think it's really, really cool. You're managing lots of different resources. In particular, you're managing money. There is money management in this game for players who like money in their games. And you're also managing your coal. And there's 4 different types of coal, and they all vary in their value. And you're trying to fulfill particular contracts. Some of these contracts only require multiple of one type of coal, or maybe just one piece of one type of coal. Some of them require a combination of these different coals, and it's so cool and it's so neat because you've got this little mine area that you're manipulating through an elevator, and you're kind of like using your action points that you get through some of your work and placement spots to move your elevator down deeper into your mine, and on the bottom of the mine is where the more valuable coal is, and then you're also working your way back up in order to maneuver these coal pieces and put them onto your contracts and fulfill them. So cool. And probably the neatest thing of this game is that there's only 3 rounds. They're pretty long though. And each of these rounds have a scoring round after it. So you're going to score 3 times in the game. But the scoring round progressively reveals more additional ways of scoring. So at the end of the first round, you can only score in 4 different ways. But at the end of the second round, you're able to score in 8 or 9 different ways. And then by the end of the game, you're scoring in like 12, 13 different ways. So it's really, really cool. So at the moment, you're focusing on the things that are going to score you in the present immediately. But in the back of your head, you're also keeping the long-term strategy in mind as far as what are the things that are going to score for you at the end of the game. Really cool. Very well done. Again, a boring theme. Not necessarily a looker of a game, but from a mechanical perspective, awesome game. My number 2 Wolfgang Kramer game of all time, Coal Bearing. Now we move on to my number 1, and this is my favorite and has been my favorite Wolfgang Kramer game since the moment I played it. As a matter of fact, it was the first Wolfgang Kramer game I ever played, and despite the fact that I played so many others since, no other game can dethrone this game. I'm a sucker for the classics. My number 1 is El Grande. And this in particular is a co-design with Richard Ulrich. And this is the big box edition, which includes 5 expansions, of which I have played 2. And those 2 expansions have breathed new life into the game for me and have definitely contributed to it still warranting this number 1 spot on my list. This game is the grandfather of the area majority mechanism, where you have a board that consists of a bunch of different sections. In the case of El Grande, you have a map of Spain divided into its different regions and provinces, and players are trying to have the majority in these areas by the end of a scoring round. And this game is so cool because according to the player count, you open up additional opportunities for scoring. So in a 3-player game, only people who are first or second in particular regions are going to score points. But if you're playing a 4 or 5-player game, then even the 3rd place person in a particular region or area will score a little bit of a consolation prize. I think it's really, really cool. And it's so neat because at the beginning of the game, you're doing an auction for turn order. An auction for turn order has got to be one of my favorite mechanisms, because it makes turn order mean so much. Sometimes turn order is just a random, decide randomly or through some silly mechanism. Sometimes turn order is simply passed around clockwise for no reason. And sometimes, worse yet, turn order is static and never changes throughout the game. In this game, you're always going to change, and chances are you're going to get at least 1 round where you get to go first if you really, really want it, because you're bidding these power cards to determine turn order throughout the game. And after you determine turn order, you're drafting these action cards, and these action cards determine 2 things. They determine how many of your caballeros, that is your meeples or your wooden pieces, you get to place on the different regions, and it also determines what special action you can carry out. So some of the more valuable, higher ranked action cards might make you put more caballeros but give you a weaker action, while some of the lower ranked action cards let you place fewer caballeros but give you a more interesting dynamic action at your disposal. So that's something to consider. Also, it's very restrictive because you have this big purple pawn, which represents the king of Spain. And in order to do an action or place a worker or a meeple down, you need to place it adjacent to one of the regions in which the king finds himself in. So manipulating this king is a very big part of this game. This game plays very, very well at 3 or 4 players. It's somewhat functional at 2, but again, for this game to shine, you're probably going to have to play at 4 or 5 players. Such a classic game, very streamlined, the poster child for area majority, and the game that still, till this day, I think lots of area majority games look to for inspiration. My number 1 Wolfgang Kramer game of all time, El Grande. And that's it for today's list, folks. Thank you so much for joining us here at When Harry Met Board Games. Consider subscribing to our channel. Please comment down below and tell me what you think about Wolfgang Kramer. What's your favorite Kramer design? Which of these games you think do not deserve to be on this list? And which game have I omitted? Obviously, it's because I have not played it, because as I mentioned, these are pretty much all the games that I've played of Wolfgang Kramer. Thank you so much for joining us here at When Harry Met Board Games. This is Harry saying take care, everybody. Stay safe, stay healthy, and have fun gaming. Bye-bye.